What part of your inner being is satisfied by a work of art? And why is this satisfaction something we all crave? Subjective as it all is, good art makes us feel more appropriate about ourselves, and bad art makes us feel inappropriate about ourselves. Looking at works from different time periods and different civilizations, you wonder where the strictly enforced values come from that these people rely on for propriety's sake. In medieval China, if you tried to paint landscapes in color, rather than the trademark black and white, were you a social outcast? And in Japan, with their lovely two-dimensional paintings that emphasize flat planes of color and graphic quality that inspired the Western artist Vincent van Gogh, what happened if you tried, as an artist in feudal Japan, to give three-dimensional volume to a painted figure, like a Renaissance portrait? And why are African figurines distorted in their trademark manner? And was it illegal to paint them bright rainbow colors? Then there's the famous tribal masks, the main place where we see African painting. Why don't the pre-colonial Africans paint on flat panels or ladder-day canvases, or create frescoes like the Europeans? Why does it feel inappropriate to even suggest this? Like I'm being rude somehow by saying this out loud. Something about our communal sense of propriety, and what is acceptable for public display. What rules does it follow? Why do values vary so much from culture to culture? When you make something yourself, you instinctively create according to what you need in order to feel appropriate about yourself. No one ever told you specifically to do it this way. It's just what you developed over the years in order to cope with a world that makes you feel so inappropriate about yourself. And hopefully whatever you create can help the rest of us with that very same struggle. Take a visit to the monastery and enjoy a lecture from Sandro Sebastian, the art monk. We neglect to remember at times a certain underrated wisdom that develops itself throughout the years spent on Earth. Living and maturing as our aging process happens, this specific kind of underrated wisdom is such that it lessens the anxiety about getting older, as a matter of fact, and makes that natural process less of the ghastly thing that our current culture would have us believe. This mysterious, never-mentioned wisdom that we don't consider is fueled by an abstract notion of our inner worlds, our inner self-esteem, inner reality, and personal journey through adulthood. In short, we here at the Still Life organization have created a specific way of analyzing your aging process according to this under-discussed wisdom that is not in regards to your physical being, your biology, or anything legal, financial, or political about your time here on Earth. No, I wouldn't presume to be so invasive about such subjects anyhow, and yet the forthcoming wisdom I elucidate might have you question the propriety of the matter in what I do describe to you about you, myself being nothing more than a random stranger, broadcast to you from somewhere out there in this great big world of ours. But you may throw your drink in my face if you wish only after I begin the description. Fair? No. Well, I'm going to go ahead and do it anyway. And just so there's no misunderstanding, I wouldn't discount those scientific, financial, or political aspects of your existence, claiming that they are unimportant, their necessity in maintaining proper health throughout life being undeniable. I am merely offering a less thought-of description at which we've arrived here at Still Life, one that is not so concrete and not measured by height, weight, or dollars or cents. Our current society worries itself over only the insecure, highly anxious side of aging, recognizing exclusively the disadvantage of there being fewer years remaining before you, and tragically overlooking what benefit there is to be discovered in the advantage of possessing greater years now behind you, with experience gained along the way. At the time of your youth, you had all the promise and potential of the future, but none of the wisdom and experience brought on by the adventures not yet had before your then upcoming future had occurred. Ultimately, you are presently capable of less as a result, as a youth, your inexperience limiting you. Now that years have gone by, and wisdom and experience have blossomed with age, you may have less years left ahead of you, but are capable of doing so much more with said remaining years. There is no need to view the glass as half empty, as most people seem to think. So you might give an abstract description of the psychological side of aging by stating that the older you get, you swap looking beautiful on the outside for becoming beautiful on the inside. Let's talk about how you see yourself inside of your head. What does it mean, in the abstract sense, to be a person in one's 20s? Throughout the decades of your life, each tone changing from one decade to another, what is distinct about the decade of your life that is your 20s? Well, I immediately describe it as the first decade of adult life, and such it is, the only decade of your life where society expects you to act like an adult when you've never done this before. So we can observe that in your 20s, you are given to act just like a teenager, but a teenager without parents. Because, for lack of a better idea, that is precisely what you are, psychologically speaking. At this moment in the conversation, every adult now remembers their own 20s, thinking, yeah, that's pretty much what I did. Act like a teenager without parents, and boy, have I still got the scars to prove it. But how about 30? What tone shift do we experience then? Well, we might celebrate the decade of our 30s as the first official decade in where we are more than just a teenager without parents. Not that we will not have more decades after our 30s that are to be described as such, but this one is the first one, so that's new. We now find ourselves capable of just a little bit more than we were a decade ago at a measly 20, just some teenager without parents. Phew, thank God that's over. Okay, but how about turning 40, Sandro? What is compelling about that decade? Is there any first time happening there that we haven't had already? There is certainly no new ground within yourself to explore there, right? I suppose you might take a closer look at your 40s and experience it as the first decade of adult life where you've already had a full decade of adult life that is more than just being a teenager without parents. Your 40s are your first one that's not your first. You couldn't say that one decade ago in your measly 30s, where you've never even had one full decade of adult life after your teenager without parents 20s. Oh, how naive you were. What did you know back then? Think about everything available to us now in our 40s. Phew, now we can really get started around here. So then let's move on to the 50s, Sandro Sebastian. Certainly we've run out of compelling decades now. There can't be anything more abstract to describe now in your psychological journey through adulthood. It's all over. Everything will shift into autopilot from this point on, now that we've hit 50. Well, this decade, your 50s, is not your first decade of adult life after your teenager-minded 20s, because that was your 30s. And it is not your first decade that is not your first decade after the teenage-minded 20s, because that's what your 40s were. We could say that what separates your 50s from your 40s is that now you have, for the first time, one full completed decade of adult life that is not your first decade after your teenage-minded 20s, now securely behind you. You've never had that before. Think about how much more that makes you capable of now than you were just one decade ago, in your 40s, when the only decade of adult life you had securely behind you was your first one, those 30s. Psh, what good does that decade do you anyway? Now that we have begun our 50s, we've got not just one, but 2 decades of adult life after our 20s now behind us. The first one and the first one that was not the first one. Think of all the wisdom that unlocks. Only now does the real journey begin. I mean, up until now, have we really been living? Have we? But once you are at 60, certainly it has ended there, right, Sandro? All compelling decades that serve as a first are neatly behind you, and your identity is certainly done developing. You can't press forward once in your 60s. What other firsts are there? You had your first one that was not your first one, and your first one where you had a first one that was not your first one already behind you. So what's to be celebrated about the uniqueness of being in your 60s? How about that up until this point, you've never had multiple decades behind you that were not your first one after your teenage-minded 20s? 1 decade ago, in your 50s, the only decade that wasn't your first, that you could claim as fully completed behind you, was your 40s. Your second decade that's not your first one after your teenage-minded 20s, your 50s, you were currently completing. But now we are at 60, and for the first time have multiple decades fully completed that are not our first one after our teenage-minded 20s. Now we've broken new ground. So that's a new thing. That's never happened before. Time for an all-new part of your personality to come out and greet the world. Who knows what crazy adventures you'll have now, with the new wisdom gained that only us people in our 60s know about. Oh, what's that, little people in your 50s? You have only had 1 decade of adult life behind you? That's not your first one after your 20s? Oh, I'd forgotten. So you don't know about having multiple decades of adult life behind you that are not your first one after your 20s. Get back to me when you've made it to 60. Only then does the real party begin. Boy, we thought we were living before. But when we hit 60, now I see how naive we were. We didn't have a clue what real living was. Hey. Okay, so now I'm wondering, how will this Sandro Sebastian guy describe the decade of your 70s? Will he call it the first decade where you have 3 decades of adult life behind you that aren't your first one after your teenage-minded 20s? I mean, that statement isn't technically untrue. It just isn't as compelling as the others. We used that description 1 decade ago, in your 60s, having multiple non-first decades behind you. That's still true in your 70s, but now you've got 3 instead of 2. This isn't so helpful as it could be. Maybe we could do better. Your 70s are the first decade where you experience no firsts. Whoa. You've completed all your firsts by this point in your life, and life shifts into a more mature phase now, finally, since that silly first decade business is all said and done now. Think of all those naive, silly people under 70, still living a decade that is the first of something. Ha! If they only knew what wisdom and insight awaits you once you reach 70, and can experience a decade that is no longer burdened with being a first of something. Only now can life truly begin. But hold on, Sandro. If this decade is to be labeled the first decade without a first, and that has never happened before, then that gives this decade a first. So it cannot remain on the list as the first one without a first. So we have to cross it off, leaving the space empty. But that's never happened before, an empty space, a decade without a first. All other decades before this one had a first, so we have to put it back on the list. But now that that first is back on the list, it no longer qualifies as not having a first, so we have to cross it off again, which puts it back on the list, which makes us need to cross it off the list, so now it's back on, and then off. What are you trying to do, Sandro? Collapse the universe? Stop that. So let's just say that your 70s are the paradox decade. The first one that has no first, which means it does have a first. Whoa. Okay, before we all implode, let's move on. And arriving at your 80s, we certainly don't have any more firsts at this point, Sandro. Now it all turns static, shifts into autopilot. What more can shift inside of you and become more insightful? It's all over. Well, I would state first that this is your first decade after your paradox decade. You have a whole new standard of measurement. Before this, you were measuring your maturation from your 20s, the decade where you are merely a teenager without parents. Every subsequent decade is measured from that one, but your 70s are a pivotal point. From this point on, however long that may be, we can measure our distance from the paradox decade, the first decade with no first. Your 80s would then be the first decade after the first with no first. Trippy. So think what possibilities lie before you now in this special kind of decade that wasn't possible at any other point in your life before the pivotal paradox decade. Let the good times officially roll. Now that we've hit 80, oh, now we're moving. People think to only focus on how little time you have left, but don't look at it that way, man. It's the amount of experience you have behind you that helps you make these final years count even more than any other years before. So your 90s then, Sandro. If you are blessed to make it so far. You aren't likely to make it past here, so the adventure is certainly done. There certainly can be no compelling shift in tone here. It's truly all over. Nothing to do now but wait to die. Well, I could agree with the stated fact that it is overwhelmingly likely to be your last decade, yes, but that doesn't mean you are only allowed to wait until you die. You still have permission to do what only 90-year-olds can, and that is to practice whatever wisdom that only that blessed segment of the population has earned by making it this far. Think of it like this. It's the one decade where you have to think the least about what happens in the next decade, because this is a decade you are most unlikely to see the end of. Well, that sounds rather callous, Sandro. Does it? You asked me what made this decade special. There's certain things only a person in their 90s can think and do, with them being in the decade that is overwhelmingly most likely to be their last. Those young pups in their 80s still might have another decade after this, so there's still a bit of future to plan for, but us people in our 90s, well, our psychology will make us capable of something special that no one else can be, for better or for worse, depending on the individual personality. It's the first decade that is most likely to be your last decade of life. That's all I got. But you get the picture of this kind of lecture, don't you? There is more than just our physical development. There is the journey we take in our minds, discovering our inner identity and figuring out how to feel appropriate about oneself along the way. Maybe I can help, wherever I am on my timeline. Perhaps this might make a good commencement speech at a college graduation, or a very depressing one. So if I am a man in my 30s right now, and we are using my description of age, all of a sudden being in my 30s doesn't seem so old anymore. So if we might round out the discussion, this speaker before you hasn't yet completed his first decade of adult life in where he is more than just a teenager without parents. The only full decade I know is the teenage-minded 20s. That's the only one I have behind me. Aw, he's just a little baby. Aw. Hey. Well, I'll try to help make the future more civilized and make sure we can all feel appropriate about ourselves. We'll check back in when I'm in my 40s and see where I'm at. So, Mr. Sandro Sebastian, now that we've gone and finished the formal introduction, let me as the viewer have my turn now and demand the answers I need in order to continue viewing this program of yours. Since you as the presenter need me, the viewer, to sit here giving you my undivided attention in order for this transaction to work to your benefit, my crucial participation does require that you provide me a bit of information regarding your own professional status, if only to avoid giving the impression that you take me for granted. Such is the proper etiquette for our transaction. Let me then ask, what kind of celebrity are you? As in, what kind of cultural phenomenon classification are you wanting from us? Are you like a Hollywood actor, or a pop star, some New York Times best-selling author? Are you a Hollywood filmmaker? Are you represented by a gallery? Does your work hang in a museum somewhere? Maybe you give art lessons or something? Perhaps you are a professor at a university. I need a sense of who I'm dealing with on paper. How shall we let a painter fit into our lives in the modern world? Well, there won't be one answer that covers all for a question like that. But what might separate me from my Hollywood celebrity counterparts is that those manufactured icons, between movies, television, and music, all sent down the assembly line of corporate-controlled capitalism, are desperately begging you to pay attention to me. The psychological purpose is to grab your attention by way of the part of life you experience on the surface, responding to stimuli off the top of your head so that I can be rich. But these days, there is a less and less acknowledged difference between something that grabs your attention and something that requests you to give your attention. The latter requires concentration and a little bit of looking inward and knowing who you are, while the former just requires having a pulse. Like I said, the small community of people that control the part of our lives that exist on paper, your education and job opportunities, and what kind of lifestyle you can afford, those people that move our lives around like pieces on a chessboard are the people who mass produce the pop culture grab your attention off the top of your head type of content. Now that someone describes it that way, and you picture that very content, does that make sense? Do you recognize it by the smell? After all, they know exactly what your lives look like on the surface, because they are the ones who built it for you to live inside of. A Sandro Sebastian type is creating an exercise to practice a new kind of concentration, something that uses a bit more of the brain than you use while sitting in your cubicle, manufactured by the people who rule over your lives on paper, the people who move around your lives like pieces on a chessboard, these powerful people who really do not give you enough credit. What a Sandro Sebastian type provides is something that should be a bit strange at first, and a bit uncomfortable, because you are flexing new muscles. Growth is always uncomfortable. But if I teach you to see a new shade of color out there in the universe that you never saw before, once you look up and take another glance at the world you thought you knew, that new shade of color makes everything look just a bit more beautiful, now doesn't it? And those people who control your life's existence on paper, you realize that the part of you that does not exist on paper is something that no one can control, no one can own. It is not for sale and has no price. You might imagine me approaching painting not like a science, or even like an art, but like a description of a part of you that your society has cheated you out of. I approach each painting like this is the first painting I've ever done, and when presenting it to others, as though I am presenting the first painting that has ever been done. Imagine that you alone are responsible for selling the concept of visual expression to an isolated society of people who've never had the idea introduced to them before. Could you sell them on it with the work alone? Maybe that's what you're doing every time, even with people who have seen lots of paintings before. If it feels manufactured, on the capitalism assembly line, that wouldn't be convincing to this isolated community who has never seen one before. Therefore, we are looking for something primal, something inherent, something instinctive. Do you have to know anything about painting in order to respond to this painting so far? Maybe you just have to know about yourself. Maybe knowing about yourself is knowing about painting. I mean, this instinct has to come from somewhere deep inside of you. When you improvise shapes and figures on a blank surface, it comes from inside that part of you that does not exist on paper. The part that no one can tell what to do. That part that's not for sale and no one can own. These are the chess pieces that they cannot move, despite their influence over your professional life. It's the part of you that's more than just the dork in the cubicle that they turned you into. But don't worry, we'll break you out of there. Now, if I could promise you one thing, it would not be a promise that you would like everything I have to say, or even agree, but I promise to always talk to you like an adult. Is that fair? I will do that for you because I like it when people do that for me, talk to me like an adult. It makes me feel respected. Don't worry, I'm a big boy, I can take it. I'm aware that the world is a big place and we're not always going to see eye to eye. But just because we're talking like adults doesn't mean we can't have a childlike sense of magic and wonder. My goal isn't to come off like a wise old man, or like an enthusiastic little kid. My goal is to come off like an enthusiastic kid with a wise old man's level of life experience. Like a kid who's been a kid for 4,000 years. It's about getting back to that moment in your life before you were taught to doubt yourself. But to have it be fueled by an adult world wisdom, of course. Art definitely comes from the part of you that never grew up. Just make sure it's an interesting part of you that never grew up, not an obnoxious part. We don't want to come off like a 13-year-old boy that's simply trapped in an adult man's body. That might work for being a Hollywood celebrity, but not for a legitimate artist. So what's the childhood naive quality that you never outgrew, Sandro Sebastian? What is your art based on? What childlike enthusiasm do you present to us with the wisdom of a wise old man? For some reason, when I saw the power that images have to make something grumpy inside of you feel soothed, to move something lonely inside of you to feeling loved, I adopted this childlike belief that I can fix all problems in life by making something beautiful. If life gets scary or difficult, I can just make something beautiful and everything will be all right. It can solve problems between people and fix hurt feelings and make people act more civilized. No matter what happens to me or what I saw happen in the world, some small part of me was never discouraged from that belief. There is a beautiful quality about the child's imagination and how it has yet to discover how the adult world really works. As a result, the child imagination is better at believing in things. But really, how well do the adults understand how the adult world works? Maybe that's why it has so many problems. When I see certain things in the news, or see the pain people live with, and see the toxic way people treat each other, I think, with sorrow, why can't I just make something beautiful and have it make everything all right? So that's what I'm going to do, says the childlike Sandro Sebastian that the adult man holds on to. I'm going to make art so beautiful that everyone is going to forget what they're mad about. I will create a future where everyone is polite and civilized, and everyone is considerate of the feelings of others, and nobody feels like they are not good enough. I'm going to create a future where it's impossible for anyone to feel alone. That's what kind of celebrity I am. Sandro Sebastian.